Hi, this is Jordan Robertson, and welcome back to Digital Defense. This is our weekly cybersecurity show on Facebook and YouTube. As always, this is a highly interactive show, at least we want it to be, so if you have any questions, please feel free to send them and post them, and I will answer as many as I can here. And this week I want to talk to you about a couple of things. First, I wanted to get to some reader questions that came in after last week's show, and then I also want to talk about a pretty major cybersecurity story that Bloomberg broke today. So first order of business, I want to get to some of the questions that came in last week. Really appreciate you all sending in questions and want to make sure to get to them. The first question was about, again, the election. We're going to be talking a lot about what happened in the U.S. presidential election because there was apparent tampering by a foreign power in our election, and we're getting lots of questions about it. There are lots of interesting angles to explore there. And one of those questions concerned a denial of service attack, a major denial of service attack on the U.S. About 3 weeks before the election. And the attack looked like this. This is a map showing where those outages occurred in mid to late October. It's a major attack involving closed-circuit TV cameras, DVRs, very novel kind of attack, but it knocked out communications to large parts of California and the West Coast, big parts of the East Coast, New York, Pennsylvania, and parts of the Midwest as well, Ohio, Illinois. And the question from a reader in Sweden was, was there any connection to these attacks, with the results of the presidential election? It's an interesting question because what you do is if you compare this map, which shows the internet outages across the major internet sites, Twitter, Reddit, others like that, with a map of how Americans voted in the election, what you wind up with is a pretty interesting picture. I mean, I should caution, there's no, we haven't seen any evidence that denial of service attack was mounted by Russia, which is accused of tampering in the U.S. election. However, if you look at this map, what you see is that the regions most affected by that denial of service attack, were also the regions that kind of most heavily voted for Hillary Clinton. It's, again, there's no connective tissue that we can see, connecting these two incidents. However, the point I would like to make is we've been talking to a lot of national security experts, military experts, counterintelligence experts, folks like that, and they say, the result of a lot of these attacks is instability, and fear of instability tends to lead to more kind of strongmen, authoritarian, voting patterns. So, should evidence come out in the future linking those attacks to some sort of, attempt by the Russian government to influence the election, you can imagine a scenario in which, parts of the country that are most heavily Democratic and were most heavily favored to go for Hillary Clinton, you might imagine a scenario in which, disrupting those regions and making people feel more unsettled could sway their voting patterns. But again, it's a very good question. It's a very interesting question to explore. But again, we haven't seen any connective tissue, any evidence of connective tissue between them. So the first story that I wanted to get to today was this one here, broken by my colleagues here at Bloomberg, Mike Riley, Glenn Carey, and John Frayer. And the story is a wave of destructive cyber attacks that hit Saudi Arabia in the last 2 weeks. And the basic story is, Saudi Arabia's, Civil Air Administration and, 3 other as yet unnamed government agencies were hit by a type of computer attack which is considered like the nuclear option in hacking. These were destructive cyber attacks that wiped out computers, wiped their memory, wiped their hard drives, and basically made them inoperable. Thousands and thousands of these computers. And the attack's timing is what's really interesting here, as well as the mechanism. So the way these attacks worked was these 4 government agencies that we know of, were all infected at the same time, and this malware was detonated at the same time, and rendering thousands upon thousands of Saudi government computers inoperable. Now, the reason that's significant is most hackers hack to steal stuff. They hack to steal, either intelligence information or credit card numbers or personal information. They typically don't hack to blow things up. We have seen this a few times, most notably with Sony Pictures, when North Korea allegedly, was behind their attack, which involved kind of the same thing. Now, interestingly, we've also seen this in Saudi Arabia before a few years ago as well. Now, what's interesting is this is the same group that hit Saudi Arabia and the state oil company a few years ago is believed to be the same group behind this attack, and the attribution is the Iranian government. These types of attacks are never, the attribution is never kind of ironclad, but that's the consensus of folks who've looked at the malware, folks who've investigated the breach. The timing, is really interesting because not only did we just elect a president who said he was going to tear up Iran's nuclear deal, which is a major, the nuclear deal is a major deal for Iran, not just in relation to the U.S., but in relation to international markets in terms of where that country can ship its oil. That coincided with, a week's worth of very contentious negotiations among OPEC and among oil producers in the region about this very issue of, should Iran be allowed to increase its oil production now that it's out from under, the umbrella of these U.S. sanctions because of this nuclear deal. So you have these two converging forces kind of happening at the same time. And, a couple of weeks ago, this attack goes off in Saudi Arabia. It's hard to know exactly the attacker's motivations, but we've talked to a lot of cybersecurity experts, a lot of diplomats and other folks, and the kind of the conventional wisdom about this is that Iran is engaged in some saber rattling, saying, we are not to be messed with. We have a world-class, a cyber warfighting, division. And we're going to use some of those weaponry to intimidate opponents. It's in some cases it's seen as a shot across the bow, against President-elect Trump in the U.S. Like, if you want to tear up our nuclear agreement, be prepared because we have weapons. And for Saudi Arabia, which is Iran's kind of chief rival in the region, the two have been fighting proxy wars for years. Currently in Syria and Yemen, and this can potentially be viewed as an extension of that. This is a shot across the bow as well to say, don't mess with us and our ability to dig ourselves out of the hole we were in because of these sanctions. This is, so the oil situation can't be understated here. And we're still gathering information about who the other victims were, how exactly the attack worked. But one of the details we included in the story was that this was, the exact same file that was used against Saudi Arabia a few years ago. The significance of that is the attackers are making no efforts to disguise their tracks. They're basically planting a flag and saying, yes, this was us. We did this to you before. We're doing this to you again. And there are some folks in the cybersecurity community who say that could also be a false flag. It could also be some other foreign nation trying to make us all believe it was Iran, and it may not have been. But the consensus, at least at this point, appears to be this was an Iranian attack. Getting a couple of questions in here. One of the questions is, did this have anything to do with the oil situation? As we just discussed, I mean, there's a strong likelihood that it was related. I mean, these two converging events, happening at the same time as this really kind of rare and remarkable type of attack. Again, this is not your normal everyday type of cyber attack. It is probably something worth looking at. And another question, what do you think the motive behind the attack in Saudi Arabia is? Well, as we just discussed, I mean, there is, certainly the oil situation is one. Shot across the bow to President-elect Trump could definitely be another. And in just in general, Russia has gotten a lot of the attention, kind of rightfully so in regard to the U.S. presidential election. But you talk to national security folks, and they'll tell you there are only a handful of countries that have cyber capabilities that are, that are pretty fearsome and that are pretty high level. Russia, obviously, China, Israel, of course, and Iran is another. So this may be also an attempt to kind of reassert itself and kind of put itself back on the map on the world stage and saying, hey, we're still here, and we still have these capabilities, and we're not to be pushed around. Even though Iran kind of was forced to come to the table on the nuclear talks because the sanctions had been so crippling, it's kind of reasserting itself might be a way to look at this as well. Another question was, can you talk about Trump's role in all this? Well, Trump is a lightning rod. I mean, Trump has said some pretty strong, words about his thoughts on the nuclear deal with Iran, which for viewers who are not familiar, I mean, basically allows Iran to increase oil production, remove some pretty onerous sanctions, and in return, the U.S. and other nations get access to their increased access to their nuclear facilities and increased monitoring to ensure that Iran is not developing a nuclear bomb. Trump has basically come out, President-elect Trump has come out and said, I'm going to tear up that deal. This is not a good deal. We're making a deal with terrorists. This is not the direction the U.S. should be going. Again, pretty strong words that risk, antagonizing a country that, is not exactly a U.S. ally. So in terms of Trump's role as kind of a lightning rod, he certainly, could be seen as a kind of a target by proxy of these attacks as kind of a warning shot, for increased, that if he increases his kind of strident position toward Iran, that there could be more of these types of attacks coming. Another question was, as everything's going wireless, what can we do to protect ourselves and protect the U.S.? The issue of wireless communications is, the main issue with going wireless is authentication. So, we talk about cell phones, you talk about laptop computers. There really isn't a huge difference in terms of your threat profile, based on whether you use more wireless technologies versus wired. It's just another computer on the network to attackers. So we have no indication that these Saudi Arabia attacks were influenced at all, by wireless technologies. To an attacker, a computer is a computer is a computer on the network. When you go wireless, you just have to deal more with authentication and making sure the device that you're using is expected to be on that network and is trusted. But in general, we don't have evidence that the wireless component was an element here. This is a good question. Are certain countries more vulnerable to attacks than others? This is a subject that's come up a lot in the last 24 hours as we've discussed the Saudi Arabia attack. In the cybersecurity world, there are countries in the Middle East that have invested pretty heavily in cybersecurity defenses, and U.S. firms have worked very closely with them. UAE is one such area. What this attack exposed, especially this detail that the same exact attack file was used in the 4 known attacks that we're aware of, that indicates that these government agencies did not have modern defenses, because once an attack like the earlier one against Saudi Arabia is discovered, all the antivirus companies, they update their engines. So even some really basic level of protections would have caught these attacks in theory. And the fact that this attack was allowed to go off as it did indicates that at least those government agencies did not have the more modern protections that a lot of countries do. So any country that hasn't invested in at least rudimentary protections, are going to be susceptible to this. Like, for an example, an attack, in Southeast Asia not too long ago involved the SWIFT international banking system. And what that was, an attack on a very poorly protected bank network, again in Southeast Asia, where the attackers were able to get in and modify the bank's communications, with the international banking system, and they were able to withdraw, a lot of money, based on tampering with those records. And at the core of that attack, while the mechanics of how the actual banking fraud occurred were very fascinating, at the core of it, the infection was based on, just some really poor security hygiene at the lowest level, antivirus being turned off and computers not being patched. And that's what opens the door for these bad guys. Not every attack is kind of, James Bond level, sophisticated type of attack. So countries that don't invest in those technologies are going to be vulnerable, but in general, European countries, US, big companies within those countries pretty much get it, kind of in aggregate, and have invested pretty heavily. But you have large parts of the world, Asia, Africa, obviously the Middle East, where that investment hasn't occurred. And what you see is attacks like these that are really destructive and really damaging are allowed to go off. Another question is Russia a suspect in the Saudi attack, given the Russia-OPEC tension? This is a very interesting question, because as I suggested before, when you're looking at these attacks, attribution is always really hard, or what people in the cybersecurity community call attribution. It's always really hard because on the internet you can be anybody, and it's very easy for sophisticated attackers like Russia, like Israel, like the US, or whoever, to impersonate somebody else or piggyback on an existing hack. It happens all the time among the top tier hackers. So the Russia question is interesting, because I was just reading today, this agreement that OPEC finally arrived at, again, was very contentious, weeks of contentious negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, did not want, Iran to increase its oil production, whereas every other member of OPEC basically had to take a cut to reduce, this oil glut that we have that has caused, prices to fall. Russia basically brokered a deal. Russia brokered the agreement to say, Saudi Arabia, you're going to accept a cut. You're also going to accept, that Iran will take, make a small, increase in its oil production. And there are certain parameters of this deal, but you've got to come to the table and you've got to make this happen. So this idea of a false flag operation, which is what it's called in the community, the cybersecurity community, is a very credible one, because some of the questions that have arisen have been, why would you use the same exact file, the same exact malware, if you're trying to disguise yourself at all? Well, the conclusion there is you're not trying to disguise yourself. But if you own that malware, if you're Iran and you're the proprietor of this attack, changing the malware is simple to be kind of undetected, to go undetected and to go unattributed. The fact that that didn't happen here is very revealing, and it could potentially point to one of these scenarios where you have an actor who's not Iran pretending to be Iran to kind of stoke these geopolitical tensions. And that's an important point. When we see these attacks and you'll see Iran blamed, I mean, our story, we say, the consensus view is that this was an Iranian hack. You do need to take some of that with a grain of salt because, there are always other possibilities. Certainly, Russia had an interest in these negotiations concluding. Israel has a very strong interest in the region and these negotiations. So there are a number of other actors you could potentially point to. So as always, I want to thank everybody for watching. Really enjoy getting your questions. As always, too, feel free to write me offline, and I will try to get to your questions next week on the show. Twitter handle is @JordanR1000, JORDANR1000. My email's there as well. And again, please feel free to write. Thanks again for everybody watching, and we'll see you next week on Digital Defense.